Esther Coombe stood at the back gate of Overford Mill on a Thursday, and she watched a full cart of good rag pitched onto the fire. Blues, browns, a bolt of turkey red that some house had worn to threads. She did not flinch at the smoke. She counted what burned. The overseer saw a washerwoman eyeing the ash, and he jeered. "You want the leavings, missus? Take the lot." A dozen millmen laughed with him. But Esther had washed and bleached other people's cloth for 30 years, and she knew one thing about those rags that no man at that mill had ever troubled to learn. If you believe old hands know things young eyes can't see, this story is for you. Before we go on, subscribe and tell me in the comments the town you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now, let me take you back to the beginning of it, and let me tell it slow, because the slow part is where the truth lives. Overford was a small place on the River Test, in Hampshire, in the early years of the 1850s. A church, a green, a mill, and a scatter of houses along a wet lane. The river ran clean and cold off the chalk, and it turned two wheels in that parish. One was the flour mill, the other was Fenwick's paper mill, which took in clean linen and cotton rag and pulped it down into white printing sheets. Esther lived at the far end, past the last cottage. In a lean-to with a good copper and a stone floor she kept swept. Her husband had been a carter. He was 2 years in the ground now. He had left her a lean-to, a washing copper, and an old cob called Bramble that ate more than it earned. She was 46. Her hands were the kind of hands you get from 40 years of hot water and soap and wringing, red across the knuckles. Strong in the grip, she washed for the parish, for the vicar's household and the doctors and the 2 schoolmasters and half the farmers' wives besides. 6 days a week she had her arms in the tub to the elbow. And here is the thing you must understand about Esther, before you understand anything else. She did not just wash cloth, she read it. Watch her at the tub of a morning. A basket of soiled linen at her feet. She would lift a shirt, hold it to the window light, and she would know it. She knew which dye would bleed and which would hold. She knew that a cheap blue print would run the first time it met hot water, and that a good indigo, mordanted proper, would stay true for 20 years. She knew that a turkey red would never ever come white again, however long you soaked it, because the oil and the madder were fixed into the very fibre of the thread. She knew an oiled brown from a dyed brown by the smell of it wet. She knew that grease would lift with lye, but that tar would not. That a rust stain wanted lemon and a wine stain wanted salt and quick hands. She knew cloth the way the vicar knew his scripture. Chapter and verse, which is to say, she knew it in her bones, without having to think, and she was almost never wrong. One morning that spring she was scrubbing a collar that would not come clean, and she said a thing under her breath. She said it to nobody. She said it the way you say a thing you've thought 100 times and never once said aloud. "The mill wants what I want," she said, "only they've never asked themselves why." And then she rinsed the collar and thought no more of it. Hold on to that. She didn't understand it herself yet, not all the way. But the whole story is folded up inside that one muttered line, and I want you to have heard it before she did. Now let me take you up the lane to the mill, so you can see the thing she was looking at. Fenwick's mill was the proud thing in Overford. It made white paper, fine white printing sheets that went off by cart to the towns, to the printers and the stationers, to men who put words and pictures on them. That was the whole of the trade. Whiteness. A mill like that lived or died by how white and how even it could make a sheet. And to make a white sheet, you needed white rag. Clean linen, clean cotton, sorted careful, the whiter the better, because the paper could only ever be as white as the rag you started with, and no whiter. So the mill bought rag. Sacks and sacks of it. And here, I want to plant something small, and I want you to barely notice it, the way you barely notice a cloud on a fine day. Most of that white rag did not come from Overford. It came from far off. It came up from the ports, and a great deal of it came across the sea from the continent, from the great rag markets over the water, because England alone never grew enough clean rag to feed all her paper mills. The whole trade rested on that flow, on sacks of white rag coming steady across the water, cheap and plenty. As long as it came, the mill hummed. Nobody at Fenwick's ever lay awake over it. Why would you lie awake over the weather when the weather's been fine your whole life? Remember that. Cheap white rag, across the water, that's the cloud on the fine day. Now the mill bought rag by the sack, and it sorted it hard. Anything white and clean went to the vats, but a deal of what came in was no good to them at all. Coloured stuff, dyed stuff, print rag that would run, turkey red that would never bleach, tarred canvas, oiled aprons, greasy brown twill, rag that would not come white, however you boiled it, and a white paper mill has no use on God's earth for rag that will not come white. So they threw it out. Every week they heaped it in a corner of the yard, the reject pile. And every Thursday they burned it, out at the back gate, in a great sullen fire that smoked all afternoon. They burned it because they could think of nothing else to do with it. Esther passed that gate most Thursdays, going to and from the doctor's with her baskets, and she would slow, and she would look at the fire, and something in her would tighten like a fist. Because she was standing there reading that pile the way she read a shirt at the window. Blue, brown, red, good stout cloth, most of it. Cloth that had years of wear left in it. And they were burning it to keep the smoke going. It took her a long while to put it into words, even to herself. Weeks, months maybe, but you already know the shape of it, because I told you at the start, so let me just lay it out plain the way she finally did. The mill needed white rag. Yes, but white was only a need because of what they made. They made printing paper. And printing paper has to be white, because you print black ink on it, and you want the letters to stand up sharp and clear. White was a rule of their trade, their market, the printers over in the towns, but the mill's market was not the only market in the world. Think, she thought, what does a village need? Not printing sheets. A village hardly prints a thing. A village needs wrapping. It needs the blue sugar paper the grocer twists his sugar into. It needs the coarse brown the draper folds a parcel in. It needs cartridge paper, stout and cheap, for the schoolboys to draw and cipher on. And for all of that, whiteness is nothing. Nothing at all. Nobody ever asked, was the sugar paper white? They asked, was it strong, and was it cheap, and did it hold the sugar without tearing? And coarse blue and brown paper wants coarse blue and brown rag, which is exactly what they were burning. Every Thursday, out the back. She stood at the doctor's kitchen door one afternoon, with that in her head, fully formed at last, and her heart was going like a girl's. She knew the way she knew a turkey red would never bleach. Those rags were not rubbish. They were the wrong rubbish for the wrong trade, that was all. To a white paper mill they were worthless. To a coarse paper maker they were the whole of the raw material, free for the taking, going up in smoke, because one man had one idea of what paper was. They only had one use for cloth. She had two. Now I'll not pretend she saw the whole road from there. She did not. She was a widow washerwoman with red hands and a lean-to. She had no vat, no mould, no money, and no notion of how paper was truly made beyond what her eyes had picked up passing the gate. What she had was the one thing the mill did not have, which was the knowing that the burnt rag was worth something to somebody. And she had a fault. I'll tell you her fault now, because it matters. Esther believed, deep down, that a laundress had no standing to be heard by millmen, that women like her fetched and carried and held their tongues, and that the world was carved up long ago into those who owned the mill and those who scrubbed the mill's linen. She did not think it was fair. She simply thought it was so it cost her something to walk up to that gate. More than you'd think. It was a burning Thursday when she did it. Full summer. The reject pile was high that week, and the fire was just being lit, and there were a good dozen men about the yard. Silas Renwick was there, the manager, a dry, careful man with a ledger always somewhere near his hand. And young Thomas Peel was there, the overseer. A clerk, really, a sharp-faced young man who wanted nothing in the world so much as to be noticed by Mr. Fenwick. Esther set down her basket by the gate. She smoothed her apron. And she walked in among them, a woman in a grey dress among a yard full of men, and she went to Renwick, and she spoke up plain. "Mr. Renwick," she said, "may I have the rags you burn?" There was a little silence, the kind where men are deciding whether a thing is worth their notice. "I'll take them off your hands," she said. "The coloured rag, the stuff you put on the fire of a Thursday. I've a use for it. I'll not trouble you for the white, only the burnt stuff. May I have it?" And she stood there, offering nothing, asking a mill for its ashes, and she waited. It was Peel who broke it. He looked her up and down, the grey dress, the red hands, the washing basket by the gate, and a grin spread over his face, and he said it loud, so all the yard would hear him be clever. "You want the leavings, missus?" he said. "Take the lot." And the yard laughed, a dozen men, laughing at the washerwoman who wanted the rubbish. Peel looked round to see Renwick smile at his wit. That was the wound. Not the words even. The laughing. Esther felt it go into her like cold water, and everything she believed about her standing in the world stood up and said, "You see, you should never have come. But here is the turn. And it is not the turn you think." Renwick did not laugh long. Renwick was looking at his ledger in his head, the way he always was, and what Renwick saw was not a mad old woman. What Renwick saw was a nuisance walking up and offering to carry itself away, because that Thursday fire was a plague to Silas Renwick. It cost him a boy's wage every week just to heap and tend it, and worse, far worse, the smoke of it drifted over the churchyard wall of a Thursday afternoon, and the vestry had complained of it 3 times that year, and there was talk of the parish making a formal trouble of it. Smoke over the graves. A standing quarrel Renwick did not want, and could not win. And here was this woman offering to make the whole thing disappear. No fire, no boy's wage, no smoke over the churchyard, no vestry. He held up a hand, and the laughing died down. "You'll take all of it?" he said. "Every week? Clear the pile?" "Every week," said Esther. "All of it." Renwick thought for the space of 3 breaths. Then he said a thing that changed her whole life, and he said it the way a man crosses out a line in a ledger. Flat, practical, not one grain of kindness in it. "Don't carry it in a sack," he said. "It'll take you a dozen trips and you'll drop it up the lane. I'll have the pile carted down to you. Once a week, a cartload, down to your place, Thursdays, save us the fire." Do you hear what happened there? She asked for a sack of ashes. He offered her a cart, a whole cart, delivered, every week. To the men in that yard it looked like a great foolish charity, a mill giving away carts of goods to a washerwoman. That's why the story ran round Overford the way it did. The mad generosity of it, but it was never charity, not a grain. Renwick was paying to be rid of a fire, a wage, and a fight with the church. He'd have paid more than a cartload to be shut of that smoke. He got a woman to haul his trouble away for nothing, and thought himself the winner of the bargain. And that, right there, is the asymmetry. You saw it. The men in the yard did not. They saw a soft-headed manager giving a poor widow the mill's leavings out of pity. They laughed about it in the Overford alehouse for a week. Renwick sends the washerwoman a cart. Ha! Esther walked home that afternoon with the laugh still stinging and a cart promised. Both at once. That's how these things come. Wounded and blessed in the same 5 minutes. and you can't yet tell which one matters more. Word of it reached Josiah Fenwick within the day, of course. Fenwick owned the mill. He was a big, prosperous man who wanted two things in the world. He wanted the fine white printing contracts, the prestige ones, the ones that let him say his sheets went to the best presses in the county. And he wanted the town to defer to him, to touch a hat, to know he was the important man in Overford. Peel, hungry as ever to be noticed, brought him the story like a cat bringing a bird. The washerwoman, Renwick giving her the reject pile. A whole cart of it, weekly. Peel told it as a joke, expecting the master to laugh with him. Fenwick barely looked up. "Let the washerwoman rake the ashes," he said. "It's no matter to me what she does with rubbish." And he went back to his letter. He was writing to a printer in the town about a contract for a great run of fine white sheets, and the doings of a widow with a cart of burnt rag were beneath the very ink he was using. He dismissed her from his mind entirely. Rubbish given to a rubbish woman. That was the whole of it, to Josiah Fenwick. Hold that in your mind. The proprietor of the mill has just decided that Esther Coombe is not worth a second thought. You and I will remember he said it. He will not. So now Esther had a cart of coloured rag coming to her door every week, and not the first idea in the world of how to turn cloth into paper. She was not a fool, though. She knew what she didn't know. So she did the sensible thing, which was to find people who knew a piece of it, and to buy an old broken bit of the craft cheap. She took in Ruth Soden first. Ruth was a widow like herself, a big steady woman with no fear of hard wet work, and Esther could not pay her, not at first, so she offered her a share instead of a wage, a share of a thing that did not yet exist. Ruth looked at her a long moment and said she'd nothing better to lose, and shook her hand. Then came Sally Mott, a girl of 17, with the quickest, cleverest hands Esther had ever seen, quicker than her own had ever been. 3 women then, a widow, and a girl. The gear she got by luck and by looking. A small mill up the valley had broken up, gone under, and its bits were being sold off for what they'd fetch, and there Esther found the thing that this whole story turns upon, a hand mould and decal. Let me tell you what that is, because it matters, and because it's the beautiful part. A mould is a wooden frame, and stretched across it is a fine mesh of wires, close as a sieve. The decal is a second frame, a loose one, that sits on top of the first like a lid with no middle, and it makes the edge of the sheet. You dip the mould into the vat of pulp, the wet stew of beaten rag and water, and you lift it out flat, and the water drains through the wire mesh and leaves behind a thin, even skin of fibre. That skin, dried and pressed, is a sheet of paper. Every sheet of paper in the world, in those days, was lifted out of a vat by a pair of hands and a mould exactly like that one. Esther bought it for a few shillings from the broken-up mill. She carried it home wrapped in sacking like it was a child. She did not yet know she was carrying home the tool that would lift her out of that lean-to. She just knew it was the heart of the thing, and that without it there was no paper at all. They set up in the yard and the old barn. 2 vats, in time, though they started with 1. A press, worked by old Bramble the cob, who plodded a circle and turned the great screw down onto the wet sheets to squeeze the water out. Her dead husband's horse, still earning its oats, still pulling for her. There was something in that Esther never spoke of, but Ruth understood without a word. The man was gone, but the horse he left turned the press that made the paper. His legacy was in the very works. And then began the hard part, the part nobody tells you, the 11 months. Because knowing that the burnt rag could be paper is one thing, making it into paper is another thing entirely, and it near broke them. You cannot just boil old cloth and lift out a sheet. The rag has to be sorted, first, and this is where Esther's whole life bent to her use. She sorted the coloured rag by fastness the way she'd sorted the parish washing for 30 years. This blue will run, keep it from that batch. This brown is oiled, it wants harder beating. This bit is tarred, it's no good for anything, throw it by. Turkey read in with the browns for a muddy but honest colour. She read every cart the way she read a basket of washing, and the girls learned to read it after her. Then the sorted rag must be cut. Cut small, by hand, with a blade, hour on hour, until your shoulders burned. Then, retted, which is to say wetted and left to soften and rot down a little, which stinks, and you must judge it right. For too little and it will not beat, and too much and it rots away to nothing in your hands. Then beaten to a pulp, on and on, until the cloth gives up being cloth and becomes a grey soup of loose fibre floating in water. That beating is the whole quality of the paper. Underbeat it, and the sheet is weak and full of lumps. Overbeat it, and it's slow to drain and rots on the wire, and they had no bleaching stage at all. That was the whole point, wasn't it? She was not trying to make it white. So she skipped the one costly poisoning step the big mills lived by, and that saved her money, but it also meant every fault showed. There was no whiteness to hide behind. The first sheets were a heartbreak. I want you to see them, because the failures are the true measure of what the success cost. They came off the mould-streaked, great ugly bands of dark and light where the pulp had not been evenly mixed. They came off with lumps in them, hard little knots of underbeaten rag. They came off too thick on one side and near transparent on the other, because lifting an even sheet from the vat is a skill of the wrists that takes months to learn. A little shake of the mould, just so, to lock the fibres together, and if you do it wrong the whole sheet is refuse. Some batches rotted in the retting and stank, so the neighbours complained, and the smell of a rotten batch is a smell you do not forget. Some sheets, dried and lifted proud, tore in your hand like a wet leaf. Sally was the one who got it first. Her quick hands found the shake before Esther's older ones did, and there was a bitter proud morning when the girl lifted a sheet cleaner than the mistress could, and Esther had to laugh at herself and hand the best mould to the youngest pair of hands. That's a hard thing for a proud woman. Esther did it. That tells you something about her too. But clean sheets came slow, and the coin ran out fast. Every week the rag came free, yes, but everything else cost. The retting, the beating, the drying, the wages she'd promised Ruth and Sally out of a trade that had not yet sold a single sheet. She sold off things from the lean too. She took in more washing at night, by candle, to feed the paperworks by day, her red hands in the tub past midnight, to pay for the vat by morning. There were nights she lay awake and did the sum, and knew that in a month, 6 weeks, there'd be nothing left. And she'd have led 2 women into ruin along with herself on the strength of a thing she'd muttered over a collar. And all this time, remember, all this time, the mill knew nothing. That's the part I love, and I want you to feel it. Up the lane, Fenwick's mill hummed along, buying its white rag across the water, making its white sheets, quite forgotten of the washerwoman with the cart. They had no notion what she was building. They did not know she'd found a whole second market for the thing they burned. They did not know she was learning, month by failing month, to make paper out of their rubbish. They still thought, when they thought of her at all, that Renwick had done a mad kind charity, and that the old woman was raking ashes. You knew, from the very first line of this, you knew what she knew and what she was after. And now you know the mill didn't. That gap, between what you can see and what those proud men could not, that gap is the whole engine of this story, and it's about to start turning in earnest. Because 11 months in, on a grey morning with the coin all but gone, and Ruth talking low about whether they oughtn't to give it up before the last of the money went, Esther Coombe walked to the good vat, the settled one, the one Sally had beaten just right and left to rest overnight. And she took up the hand mould, the same one she'd carried home in sacking, and she dipped it into the pulp, and she gave it the shake, the little locking shake it had taken her the best part of a year to learn, and she lifted it out flat and let the water run. And she stood there, in the cold barn, with old Bramble stamping in the traces and the two women watching her back, and she looked down at what was on the wire. A sheet. A clean, even sheet. No streaks. No lumps. No thin patch. No thick patch. Edge to edge the same. And a colour, a soft even sugar blue, deep as a summer evening, the blue of every good indigo rag she'd sorted out of a dozen carts and coaxed together on purpose. It was not white. It was never meant to be white. It was better than white for what it was for. It was strong, and it was even, and it was beautiful, and it was hers. Nobody spoke. Ruth put her hand over her mouth. Sally, God bless her, started to cry. Esther pressed that batch and dried it, the whole first true ream of it, sheet on good blue sheet, and she counted them, and they were saleable. There was no doubt in her hands about that. She'd sold nothing yet, mind, not one leaf. She'd only ever made paper. She had never once found out whether a living soul would put down a coin for it. But she knew a grocer. Tandy, on the Overford Green, who bought his sugar paper up from the town at a price he was always grumbling over. And Esther had held a good many twists of Tandy's sugar in her time, and knew exactly what the town paper was, and knew in her bones, the way she knew a turkey red, that her blue was stouter, and it was cheaper, and it would hold his sugar better than anything he'd ever twisted before. So on a bright cold morning she loaded that first ream of good blue paper onto the cart, her husband's cart, behind her husband's grey horse, and she tied it down careful against the wind, and she climbed up, and she took the reins in her red cracked hands. 11 months of ruin behind her, 2 women's futures loaded on the boards, every coin she had in the world already spent, and nothing, not one thing, to show it had all been worth a single day of it, unless a grocer on the green would open his till. She clicked her tongue, and Bramble leaned into the traces, and the cart rolled out of the yard and up the wet lane toward the green. Toward Tandy's shop, toward the very first time in her whole life that Esther Coombe would find out whether the thing she'd known all along was worth anything at all to anybody but herself. The green was near empty when she got there, only Tandy sweeping his step and a dog asleep in the sun. Esther pulled Bramble up short of the shop and sat a moment with the reins slack in her hands. Then she climbed down. Her knees told her about it. They always did now. She untied one sheet from the top of the ream, just the one. She carried it in to him, folded over her arm, like it was washing. "Morning, Mr. Tandy." He leaned on his broom. "Mrs. Coombe." "I've a thing to show you," she said, "and you're to tell me straight if it's rubbish." She laid the blue sheet flat on his counter, over the scarred wood where he weighed his sugar. He looked at it. He didn't touch it at first. Then he did. He rubbed a corner of it between his finger and his thumb, the way she'd rubbed 1,000 collars, testing what the thing was made of. "Where's this from?" "My barn," she said. He looked up at her. "Your barn. You buy your sugar paper up from the town," she said. "You've grumbled at me about the price of it across this very counter. 1 shilling and 4pence the ream, you told me once, and thin with it, and it tears when the sugar's damp." "It does that," he said. "Twist a bit of your sugar in that," she said, and nodded at the blue. He got his scoop, and he weighed out 1/2 pound of the coarse brown sugar, and he twisted it up in her blue sheet, the way he'd done it 40 years, 6 days a week, 10,000 times. The paper took the fold, it held the corner, he turned it over in his hand, and it did not gape, and it did not weep at the seam. "Now the towns," she said. He twisted the same 1/2 pound in his own sugar paper. It went soft at the crease almost as he watched. A little run of sugar sifted out the bottom onto his counter. Nobody spoke for a moment. The dog outside scratched at the step. "What do you want for it?" Tandy said. 1 shilling the ream," she said. "And it's the better paper, and you know it now." He didn't haggle. That was the thing she never forgot after. A grocer who had haggled her over a farthing's worth of soap for years, and he didn't haggle. He said, "I'll take what's on the cart," and he went to the till, and he opened it, and the drawer made that small bright sound a till makes, and he counted the coins into her red, cracked palm one at a time. She had made paper for 11 months. She had never once sold a leaf of it until that morning. And there it was in her hand, warm from the drawer, a few shillings of it, the first money the thing had ever made. She said thank you very ordinary, and she went out and she unloaded the ream onto his step, trip after trip, and Tandy helped her, which he had never done in his life. And when the cart was empty, she got up on the boards, and she took the reins, and she did not cry until Bramble had carried her well clear of the green, out onto the wet lane where nobody was, and then she cried the whole way home. Ruth was at the gate. She'd been at the gate, Sally said after, the best part of an hour. "Well," Ruth said. Esther held up her fist and opened it. And that was the beginning of it. It went the way a thing goes once the first stone is turned. Slow, and then not slow. Miss Loder, the draper, sent word within the fortnight that she'd heard Tandy's talk, and would Mrs. Coombe bring a sample of the brown, for she was sick to death of parcels that came apart in a lady's arms before she reached her own front door. Esther brought her the brown. It was a good stout brown, made from the tarred and oiled rag that would never in this world come white, the very worst of the mill's leavings, and it wrapped a bolt of cloth like armour. Miss Loder took a ream a month standing. Then the two schoolmasters, Overfords and Staplefords both. They wanted cartridge for the boys to draw upon, a paper with tooth to it that would take a pencil and a bit of a wash of colour, and it needn't be white, they said. In fact, the master at Stapleford said he'd sooner it weren't, for white showed every grubby thumb and put the boys off before they'd started. Esther made them a grey cartridge with a good tooth. They bought it 3 times that year. She kept her prices where she'd set them. Her blue ream at $1, her brown a little more for the weight of it, every grade of it well under what the mill charged for its own coarse paper down in the town, for the mill made its coarse grades grudging as a thing beneath it, out of rag it had half a mind to burn anyway. The works grew on the money as the money came. She bought a second vat. She and Ruth had beaten the rag by hand the first year, standing over the trough with the water gone grey and cold past midnight, and it near crippled the both of them. Now she rigged Bramble to a beater, the old cob walking his slow circle in the yard the way he'd once walked the lane with her husband's cart, and the horse did in an hour what 2 women's arms had done in a night. Sally Mott had the mould, 17 years old and the fastest hands any of them had ever seen. It was Sally, not Esther, who first got the shake of it right, the small even flick of the wrist that lays the pulp across the decal in one clean skin and no ridge and no thin place. Esther had fought that shake for months. The girl found it in a fortnight, and once she had it, she never lost it, and she stood at the vat pulling sheet after sheet, dip and shake and turn, dip and shake and turn, till the felts were stacked to her shoulder and the press was full. 3 women. 1 horse. 2 vats in a barn that had held nothing before but a lean to copper and 40 years of Esther's hot water. And it fed them all now. It paid Ruth her share, a widow who'd had nothing, and it paid Sally her share, a girl who'd have gone into service otherwise and been worn to nothing by 30. Shares, not wages. Esther had promised them that at the start when there was nothing to share but failure, and she made it good now there was something. All the while, in the town, the mill knew nothing. That was the sweetness of it and the strangeness of it both. Fenwick's mill ran on as it had always run, pulping its good white continental rag into good white printing sheets, chasing its prestige contracts, and it never once looked down the lane to Overford and thought, there's a trade there we let walk out our back gate every Thursday on a washerwoman's cart. Renwick sent the cart. He sent it because the vestry had stopped writing him about the smoke, and because he'd got his boy's wage back that used to go on tending the fire, and he thought no more about where the cart went than he thought about where the night soil went. It was gone. That was all he wanted of it. Gone, Fenwick, when the arrangement crossed his mind at all, thought of it, if he thought of it. As a small kindness he was too busy to withdraw. Peel had told him of it, that first Thursday, expecting the master to laugh, and the master had laughed. Let the washerwoman rake the ashes, he'd said, and gone back to his letters. And that was the last thought Josiah Fenwick gave to Esther Coombe for the better part of 2 years. But something was moving on the continent that neither of them had reckoned with. There was a war on. Away east, in a place called the Crimea, the great powers had gone at each other, and a war eats everything, and one of the things a war eats is rag. The armies wanted linen and cotton for their own uses, for their tents and their bandages and their 1,000 hungry needs. And the rag markets that had fed Fenwick's mill its clean white cloth for 30 years began to close their fists. Rag that Fenwick had bought at a ha'penny, the pound crept to a penny. Then past a penny. Then it was climbing toward 3p, and still there was not enough of it, and every white paper mill in the country was scrabbling for the same shrinking heap. Esther heard of it the way a village hears of anything, slow and sideways. She didn't need the newspapers. She read it in the same place she read everything, in the cloth. Because the mill's cart that used to come to her groaning full of coloured rejects began to come a little lighter. And then, a little lighter than that. She said nothing at first, but she watched the loads, the way she'd once watched the fire, and she counted what came, and she knew before anyone told her that up at the mill somebody had begun, for the first time, to look twice at rag they'd have thrown on the flames a year before. Then came the day the mill's own men bought her paper. She had it from Sally, who had it from a carter. And then she had it plain in her own hand when the order came. The mill, Fenwick's own mill, was short of cheap wrapping. It had always made its own coarse paper to bundle its good reams for carriage, made it grudging and dear out of rag it grudged to spare. And now, with every pound of rag worth 3p and rising, some clerk in the counting-house had done the sum and found that it was cheaper by a clear margin, to buy Esther Coombe's brown wrapping paper down the lane than to make their own. So they did. Quiet, at first. A standing order, 1 ream a week, to bundle the mill's white printing sheets for the road. Fenwick's white, wrapped in Coombe's brown. The very paper made from the very rag the mill had burned, now folded round the mill's own goods, because it came out cheaper on the ledger than anything the great mill could produce itself. Ruth read the order out to her in the barn, and when she'd done Esther set down the decal and stood quiet a while with her hands on the edge of the vat. "Do you see it?" she said at last. "See what?" said Ruth. "White was never worth anything," Esther said. "It was only ever wanted by the men who print. That's all whiteness ever was. Not worth. A want. One trade's particular want, and they built a whole mill on calling that want the measure of the world, and they burned everything that didn't measure up. And here's their own men, on their own paper, telling us plain what a thing's really worth is only ever what it'll do." Sally, at the mould, had stopped her hands to listen. "Pull your sheet, girl," Esther said. "Gentle, it won't wait on a sermon." And Sally pulled her sheet. But a thing like that cannot stay quiet in a town the size of Overford. The clerk's little economy came, in the end, to Fenwick's ear. And Josiah Fenwick, who had built his whole notion of himself on being the man whose mill made the white, did not hear that his men were buying a washerwoman's brown and feel the joke of it. He felt the ground move, because he was frightened now, and a frightened proud man does the wrong thing at speed. The rag famine had him by the throat. His white contracts, the prestige printing work he'd courted for years, hung on white rag he could no longer get and could no longer pay for. And into that fear came the news that his rejects, the coloured muck he'd been giving away for 2 years to be rid of a fire, were feeding a paying trade down the lane. So Fenwick reasoned as a frightened man reasons. If rag is worth 3p, he thought, then all rag is worth something, even the coloured, even the tarred and dyed. I have been giving away money on a cart every Thursday, and he sent word to Renwick to stop the cart and to bring the whole reject heap back into the mill's own yard, for the mill would pulp it now itself, every pound of it, and no more of it would go to Overford. It came to Esther as a single line in Renwick's clerk's hand. The arrangement to cease. The rejects to be retained by the mill henceforth. She read it standing in the yard with the wet coming on, and Ruth read it over her shoulder, and Sally came and read it. And none of the three of them said anything for a long moment. It was the whole foundation of the works. The coloured rag was everything they had. Without it, there were no vats, no shares, no trade, nothing but a barn and an old horse, and 3 women back where they'd started. And it was being pulled out from under them at the very moment the trade had grown big enough to matter. Sally's face had gone white as any printing sheet. What do we do? Esther folded the paper small. We do nothing, she said. Nothing? We wait, said Esther, because I know a thing they're about to find out, and it'll cost them dearer to learn it than it ever cost me. And she was right in the end, in the only court that ever mattered to her, not the vestry court, nor the market court, but the plain court of the vat, where a thing is only what it is, and no man's pride can argue with it. For Fenwick brought the coloured rag into his own vats, all that reclaimed heap of turkey red and tarred brown and oiled blue, and his vatmen did with it what vatmen do, and they tried to make it white, because that was all Fenwick's mill knew how to want. And the rag would not come white. It would not come white for 3p any more than it would come white for a halfpenny, because the price of a thing does not change what the thing is. Turkey red is turkey red. The famine changed the cost of the rag. It did not change the chemistry of it by so much as a shade. Esther Coombe had known that at her washtub for 30 years that some dyes hold and no soaking on this earth will lift them, and it had taken a paper mill and a European war to teach the same lesson to the men who'd laughed at her. Fenwick's vatman ran the coloured rag through, and it fouled the vats, and it streaked the good batches, and it turned his precious white grey and pink and useless. His prestige contracts, that hung already by a thread, stalled dead for want of a white he could not conjure out of dyed cloth, however he raged at the men who made it. He lost more in a month of ruined batches than the cart had ever cost him in 2 years of burning, and he came, in the end, to her gate. But Renwick came first. It was a Thursday when Renwick came. Esther always thought that fitting, after, the same day of the week she'd stood at his back gate and counted what burned. He drove out himself, no clerk, and he pulled up in her yard, and he got down, and he stood there, turning his hat in his hands, like a man come to a funeral. Mrs. Coombe. Mr. Renwick. You'll have had my clerk's letter. I had it. He looked at the yard, the 2 vats through the open barn door, Bramble at his slow circle turning the beater, Sally at the mould, not stopping her hands, but watching, Ruth at the press. He took it all in, the whole works of it, and Esther watched him take it in, and she saw the moment he understood what he'd been carting away on a cart every week for 2 years. The coloured rag's no good to us, Renwick said. It cost him something to say it. She gave him that much, that it cost him. We took it back into the vats. It won't bleach. It never would bleach. It's fouled 3 weeks of our white and near lost us the Rushton contract. He turned the hat again. The cart's yours, missus, if you'll still have it. The rejects are yours, all of them, same as before, and welcome to them. There was no fire behind the gate now, she thought. There'd been no fire in 2 years. The ash patch where the Thursday smoke used to rise had long gone cold and grassed over, and a man had had to come all this way to tell her plainly what the cold ash had been telling anyone who'd troubled to look. The cart can come, Esther said, but not on the old terms. Renwick's head came up. It came free before because you were burning the stuff and glad to see the back of it, she said. That's changed. You know now the rag's worth something to somebody, even if it's still worth nothing to you. So I'll pay you a fair penny the pound for the sorted coloured. Since a fair price is a fair price, and I'll not have it said Esther Coombe took charity off a mill. But the cart comes to my order, on my day, and it comes full, and if it comes light you'll hear from me." Renwick looked at her a long moment. Then something that was nearly a smile moved on his tired face. "Fair enough," he said. "You'll not hear me argue a woman who reads rag better than my own vatman." He put his hat on, and before he climbed up he said, "There's a thing you should know. Mr. Fenwick means to come himself." "Does he?" said Esther. "He does. He's in a hard place, missus. The white rag's not to be had at any price, and the contracts want feeding, and he's a notion in his head that you've fibre here he can use." Renwick shook his head. "I told him plain there's naught here but coloured rag and coarse paper. He'll not hear it from me, he'll want to hear it from you, or he'll want to see it fail with his own eyes. Either way he's coming." "Then let him come," said Esther. "I've a sheet to pull." The second thing happened before the third. That was the counting-house. For the standing order did not stop. It grew. With his own coarse paper fouled and his rag dear as gold, Fenwick's mill needed Esther's brown wrapping more than ever, and the clerk's little economy became a standing account. There came a day, she had it from the carter who saw it, when a clerk in Fenwick's own counting-house sat with the great purchase ledger open and entered, in the mill's own hand, in the mill's own book. A standing order for Coombe's brown wrapping paper, and read the figure aloud to the room as clerks do, and the figure was lower, plain and flat, than what it had cost the mill to make the same paper itself. And carrying the reams in from the yard to the store, stacking Esther Coombe's brown against the wall of Fenwick's mill, was a young overseer named Thomas Peel, the very man who had stood at that back gate 2 years before, with a dozen mill-men at his back, and jeered at a washerwoman. "You want the leavings, missus? Take the lot." He carried her leavings in on his own 2 arms now, ream after ream, and entered them to the mill's account, and he did not say one word while he did it, and there was not a soul at the gate laughing. Then Fenwick came. He came on a bright hard morning, much like the one she'd carried her first ream to Tandy on. He came in a good coat with a good horse, and he stood in the doorway of her barn, and for a moment he did not seem to know how to be there. He was a man used to standing at the head of his own mill floor, with men going quiet as he passed. He did not know how to stand in a washerwoman's barn with the smell of retting rag in his nose and an old horse walking its circle and a girl at a vat who did not stop her hands for him. Esther was at the decal. She did not stop either. "Mrs. Coombe," he said. Stiff, it came out of him stiff as a starched collar. "Mr. Fenwick." He looked about him. The vats, the press, the stacked felts, and she watched his eye go over the coloured rag sorted in its baskets by the wall, red here, brown here, blue here, the very muck he'd burned, and she saw him do the sum in his head. The frightened man's sum, all rag is worth something now. "I'll come to it plain," he said. "There's a rag famine on, you'll know it. I've fibry needs I can't meet and contracts that won't wait, and I'm told you've a supply of rag and a working stock here that I've a mind to buy of you. All of it, the rag, the stock, the trade. I'll make you a fair offer, and you'll not do better in this parish." He'd said it to buy her out. She understood that. He'd come to swallow the works whole, the way a mill swallows things, and be done with the strangeness of a washerwoman making paper down his lane. Esther pulled her sheet. Dip, and shake, and turn, and there it was laid clean on the felt, an even skin of good sugar blue, with no ridge and no thin place. She couched it. Then she straightened, with her hand at the small of her back, and she looked at Josiah Fenwick across her own vat. "You want my rag," she said. "I do. To make white. To make whatever it'll make. Rag's rag, when it's dear enough." And she let that sit a moment, because it was the whole of his error in 5 words, and she wanted him to hear himself say it. "No, Mr. Fenwick," she said. That's the thing you've never troubled to learn, and it's cost you a good deal to not learn it. Rag isn't rag. You brought the coloured back into your vats already, didn't you? You needn't answer. I can see by your face you did, and I can see how it went. It fouled your white. Of course it did. Turkey red will never bleach white. Not for a halfpenny, and not for threepence, and not for 3 shillings. The famine changed what rag costs you. It didn't change what rag is. He said nothing. His jaw was tight. White was never worth anything, Esther said. It was only ever wanted by the men who print. You called that want the measure of the world, and you burned everything that fell short of it, and you laughed at the woman who came to rake your ashes. And now you're stood in her barn because your want can't be met, and hers can. I'll not sell you my works, Mr. Fenwick. It feeds 3 of us and an old horse, and I mean to leave it standing behind me. But I'll sell you paper. I'll sell you all the brown wrapping your mill can use at the price your own clerks already entered in your own book. And you'll find it cheaper than your grief. That's my offer. And it's the only one I've got. Behind Fenwick, in the doorway, Peel stood silent. He'd come with his master. He stood there with his cap in his 2 hands, and he did not say a word, and Esther marked that too. Fenwick was quiet a long moment. A proud man, and it was reality that had broken him, not her, and perhaps he knew the difference. Perhaps he didn't, but he was a man of business under the pride, and a man of business knows a true figure when he's shown one. The brown, he said at last. At the ledger price. At the ledger price, she said. Renwick knows my terms. He put his hat on. He looked once more round the barn, at the thing this washerwoman had built out of what he'd thrown away, and then he went out to his good horse and rode back to his mill. Esther turned to the vat. Sally, she said, come take the mould a while. My back's done for the morning. And the girl came and took it and pulled a clean sheet, and the work went on. 6 seasons on, the barn hums. 2 vats now, and a 3rd being talked of. Ruth Soden stands at the press, where Bramble's harness runs, and Bramble is grey about the muzzle these days, grey as wood smoke, and he walks his slow circle a little slower than he did. But he walks it. The whole place smells of wet rag and clean water and the good sour smell of pulp, and there is not a whiff of burning anywhere in it, nor has there been for years. Up at Fenwick's mill they still make their white. They get their rag where they can, and the famine eased when the war did, and the printing sheets go out to the town same as ever. But every ream of Fenwick's white leaves that mill wrapped in Coombe's blue, and the men who wrap it don't laugh any more, and the ash patch at the back gate where the Thursday fire used to burn is grassed clean over. Nothing goes on that fire now. There is no fire. There is nothing at that mill they've a mind to burn. Because they found a use for it, and a thing you've found a use for you do not put on the flames. That was the whole of it, in the end. That was the only lesson in the whole long story. They burned it every Thursday for years, all that good coloured rag, not because it was worthless, but because they only ever had one use for a thing, and one use is a small and hungry way to look at the world. Esther Coombe had 2 markets in her head, where the mill had one, and that was the difference between a fire and a trade. She is old now, and her hands are near done, the same hands that read cloth like scripture for 40 years of hot water. So on a quiet morning she calls the girl to her, Sally Mott, who is a woman grown and the best papermaker any of them ever saw. And Esther takes up the hand mould and the decal, the same second-hand mould she bought off a broken mill all those years ago, the one that lifted the first true blue sheet, worn smooth now at the edges by 10,000 pulls, and she puts it into Sally's hands. It's yours, she says. Mind the shake. And Sally, who taught the shake to Esther in the first place, and they both know it, takes the mould and bends to the vat, and pulls a clean, even, beautiful sheet of sugar blue paper up out of the water into the light. Wherever you're watching this from, Tell me the name of your town down in the comments. I'd like to know how far Esther's story has travelled.